I got to meet this YouTuber, Ocean Keltoy, at Faithless Forum last year. He's one of the first pagans I've had extended conversation with, so I figured it would be a good opportunity to talk to him about religious people's claims about certain holidays being based on paganism. Before we get into it, I just want to shout out my Patreon. If you like what I do and you want to see me continue to do it, you can support me in a number of ways, which can be found in the description. But Patreon is probably the best way. Also, I've been pretty active on my Discord lately, so you might consider joining it. And finally, I dropped some links to Ocean's YouTube channel and some other stuff, so if you thought our conversation was interesting, give that a look too. Okay, with all that being said, let's get into it. I figured what I'd do is I would start out by kind of getting your history, your religious beliefs and background and things like that. So we'll start there and then we'll get into another subject in a second. Why don't you tell me about your belief system? Like, what are you a Christian? Are you an atheist? What's the deal?
Am I a Christian? Yes, I've been a Christian for 20,000 years. No, it's not like I was a Christian. I started out as a Christian for a long time. Probably stopped being a Christian around 21. It was an interesting transition out of Christianity. I didn't really transition from Christianity into anything immediately. I grew up like conservative Baptist and then transitioned into Episcopalian and then was Episcopalian up until there was like a version of Christianity that I was into called Celtic Christianity that's like based in Ireland.
Was this after you
actually
like left your parents' house and kind of left their religion? This was on your own, I assume, right? Okay.
Well, I mean, the Episcopalian thing was because my mother switched churches. We had a situation pop up at a Baptist church in which my mother, who was a divorced woman, was seen drinking with a man in public by somebody that was a member of the church, and that just wasn't okay. And she was part of the jail ministry. And in came the pastor in the middle of the jail ministry meeting and saying that she needed to pray with him and, get this rectified and all this other stuff. And my mom was just like, I went for a drink with a friend who happens to be a pastor. Is this a problem? Like, being a single woman in a Baptist church, it was difficult on her. So we wound up transitioning to Episcopalian church, which is a little less stringent on that kind of stuff. Where we could be Christians but not with all the crap, and that appealed to me for a long time. I got really serious about the Bible and all this other stuff, but after a while I started, like, the issue of salvation really troubled me for a long time, like that hell belief kind of stuff, and so after that I started just kind of like looking into other points of spirituality, and through a long series of events that are like it. I don't want to get into like this giant story about everything, but I wound up getting into paganism through Celtic Christianity after I started going to college. And Celtic Christianity was interesting because it had instead of original sin, it had original blessing. It was from Pelagius, a monk in I believe he was in Scotland, that a lot of churches around his beliefs kind of popped up in Ireland and Scotland in like the early period of the church. He was excommunicated around the same time as St. Augustine was running around. We got into an argument. It was Pelagius versus Augustine about original blessing versus original sin. This is turning into a very long story. I'm sorry.
No, it's super fascinating. Keep going.
So I got into Pelagius because I thought that, like, his arguments were really rational. He posited that it was possible for somebody to live without sin simply because you could have a series of events in your life that don't include sin. And he doesn't put forward that anybody's done it, but he says that because this is possible, original sin doesn't make any sense, and that he also divorced what spirituality, like the truth of spirituality, from the Bible, and rooted it in the human soul more. That where if he said if your heart of hearts, or your inner voice of your conscience disagrees with the Bible, then you should listen to that inner voice because that's the voice of God, not what's written in the Bible. And that made a lot of sense to me at the time. Um, so I was going with it. But eventually, like issues of salvation, like hell belief and all that kind of stuff, it just got to be. I couldn't make it logically make sense. But I still saw value in pursuing spirituality. So I've wound up as a polytheist, looking more at pagan traditions that Celtic Christianity was based on, because I saw a lot of the good things in it. Realized through analyzing it that a lot of the things that I found positive about it in a spiritual exploration were from ancient pagan beliefs. Like that's what was influencing it in a positive way. Um,
Right.
so as a result, I wound up exploring that more, and I've wound up as getting into a very specific form of paganism called Reconstructionist heathenry, which is essentially the idea that we can take, through examining historical sources, rebuild an ancient tradition and engage in the modern world with it. Which I've like that pursuing spirituality in that way, in that mode, has been uh, it's been a really cool adventure. First off, and it's also um, like the philosophical aspects of it I find really interesting. The uh, the ritual aspect of it, the spiritual pursuit aspect of it, are all things that I've found to be like worth pursuing.
So,
It
what
does get
is
some interesting reactions though when I say I'm a pagan. It's just like, well, why?
right? Right. Yeah.
It's yeah,
It's an
but
interesting thing. It's not something that you commonly find, I guess. You usually, especially in America, you find either Christians or non-Christians, really. I guess paganism makes up a really tiny percent of the population, I would imagine, anyway.
there's a few million of us in America.
Right?
The thing that's the thing about pagans is they're not all the like. I'm a Reconstructionist heathen, which is a very specific sliver of the pagan movement. I think most pagans are probably Wiccans, and then after that is likely heathenry. Um, but there's no survey data on it. There's like very limited survey data on pagans. There was some research done in the 90s, and one of the interesting things that came out of that was to say that like pagans are mostly college educated, but that was like the only thing that kind of came out of it. There was also a couple of other demographics that came out of it, but it's difficult to get. Like that was in the 90s. Things have changed since then. We don't know whether or not those numbers hold, because it was like 30 years ago.
And if I remember correctly, I
ago?
think
Jesus.
Wicca was actually created fairly recently, wasn't it? Like in the 60s
Yeah,
or something?
it originates in the 50s, but it's based on some older stuff. It's got a lot of roots in Crowley's Thelema,
Right.
and Thelema is based on a lot of Renaissance spirituality. A lot of
Right.
that, like I have criticisms of your video on Wicca, but the part about that you have about the Renaissance was like spot on. There's a lot of like interesting versions of spirituality that popped up around them, and a lot of those influenced Crowley, which then in turn influenced Wicca. So it has older influences. It wasn't created whole cloth in the 50s,
Right.
but it's
It really got its rise and leadership and things around that time, I
yeah.
guess. Yeah, that makes
It
sense.
popped up around the same time as Anton LaVey as well. So you had like it became part of the satanic panic, and it's like pagans and Satanists
Basically the
were
same thing, right?
yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's interesting though that like in the communities that I've been involved in, Satanists do pop up. There's a kind of an interesting kind of balance between Satanists and pagans. We don't disagree with each other too much. It's just Satanism, pagans' view of that is just like, okay, well, that's your path. It's atheistic and whatever. It's very different from what we do, but we get
Right.
along.
Neither of you are Christians, really, and it
Right.
seems like they're kind of the majority group and very controlling in a lot of ways. So I guess you can probably find common ground with Satanists and
Yeah.
even atheists.
Yeah. And that's something like with atheists, it gets. So there's a kind of a running joke in the pagan community that a lot of us haven't come out of the broom closet.
Okay.
That when we start talking about our beliefs at all, and especially to the specificity that Christians do, and people aren't necessarily bothered by that. Pagans get a weird look, because people go, why? You get some kind of interesting assumptions made, and a lot of people just don't want to deal with that, so they don't publicly say anything about being pagan. And the response comes from both Christians and atheists. You get some atheists that will say that they come at us and say we're delusional, and then you get Christians that say that we're going to hell, and then
hate from all sides. It
expands from there. So
yeah, that makes sense.
So what?
Hate from all sides, basically.
Right. And I have, I've been on Twitter and in the community for a period of time now, and I don't get as much harassment about it. It's usually, when I do, it's usually somebody who has never bumped into me at all. But usually now when people kind of come in contact with me, they've seen a couple of videos or something like that, and then they're more curious than wanting to attack me. But that's not the experience for a lot of people that, pagans that are in my subscriber base or in the communities that I'm in. They have a very different experience when it comes to being pagan openly online.
That it's kind of been an unpleasant, aggressive kind of experience for them, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. If you just there's a couple of people that I know that have tried to make a pagan Twitter kind of thing, and they wind up getting pretty consistent harassment from unfortunately it's mostly atheists,
right?
And I think that's because a lot of the Twitter sphere in the religious debate scene, atheism kind of is the main voice. I think you have a few Christians that are willing to engage, and then you have a lot of atheists, and then you have a handful of pagans. And the Christians will go at the pagans, but it's mostly the atheists that are interacting. So I think by consequence of that, a lot of what the harassment that people get is going to be from atheists.
I can see that. I figure a lot of the time Christians probably have a set of arguments that they're going to present, and they don't really know how to deviate from those arguments too well. And getting a pagan in there,
they're designed for atheists.
Yeah, exactly. And so
all of their arguments are designed for atheists. So when they bump into us, they don't know what to do.
Right.
So a lot of times they'll just check out of the conversation. It's just oh shit.
Right. And a lot of the time, I think atheists are already arguing against God existing, and so it doesn't matter too much to their argument to make it
which
multiple
God it
gods.
Is, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
but what's interesting about that, though, is that they'll come at pagans with things like problem of omnipotence or problem of evil, or the argument from the stone, that kind of stuff, which doesn't work for us because we have an idea of a variety of more limited. It's weird to say that, but when you're comparing to the Christian idea of this, I think absurd idea of omnipotence and omniscience and omnibenevolence, I think those things don't work coherently. So when you take the idea of deity and you move it into a more coherent section, it comes off as saying that it's a limited deity.
Yeah.
But our concept of deity, that those arguments don't necessarily work against, because that's not what we're arguing for. The image of God that we hold to, or what a God is just so radically different from what a Christian holds. That's what gets into conversation with Christians really interesting, is that they'll say, well, you're worshiping demons. They'll just take our experience and just relabel it, flip out God to demon, and
go about their business. Yeah. It's really fascinating, honestly, because it's throwing another belief system into the mix makes people kind of break out of the standard cookie cutter argument molds that they have already set up, and I don't know. I think that's valuable. I'm saying that as an atheist. I think having extra voices in the conversation is valuable to make people.
It mixes it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it makes people think.
And that's a lot of the comments that I get are from people. I have gotten, since starting the YouTube thing, a lot of the comments that I've gotten haven't been hate comments. They've been more just curious questions, which I've appreciated. I get the occasional hate comment, but I think they're in the minority. Um, and yeah, that's
Like,
hugely positive.
yeah, like you
Um,
mean hate comments as in stupid pagan, your stupid belief systems, blah blah
they
blah,
just
all
start.
that
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
I get a
I
couple
get
of
them too.
those. Yeah, I don't mind people that are in the comment section who disagree with me as long as they're
Sure,
not being a shit about it.
right.
Uh,
That's what it's
so
all about for
and
me.
like, yeah, I go into this fully aware that most people disagree with me,
Hmm.
and if I'm going to be, uh, making a video, making an argument or something like that, if somebody comes away from that understanding more about the polytheist or pagan position, great. That means they have understanding in the next person they bump into, and
Right.
that's the main point of what I'm doing, is that, like, oh, okay, now you know more. I don't care about converting you. We're non-proselytizing. I just want you to understand where we're coming from.
Right.
And then with other pagans that are in my audience, give them more of, like, here's arguments you can use to communicate. Here's really clear ways of putting things. Um, and that can help you in the next conversation you have about this, which I've gotten, a lot of messages saying that people are appreciative of that aspect of it.
Yeah.
It's like, this video really helped me communicate this to my family. And that's the kind of message where I'm like, whoa, I'm actually making like a difference or something like that. It's actually
It's
pretty amazing.
weird, right? To hear people say
Yeah.
that something you've done has contributed to them in some way. It's really nice. So
Yeah.
glad that I can contribute in some way. Glad you can contribute in some way. It's a nice feeling. But on that
Yeah.
note, I actually was wondering if you had some input on paganism and how it kind of formed our modern beliefs and culture. And the
Hmm.
reason I ask that is because Jehovah's Witnesses have this whole big bit about how paganism is like, it's wrapped its tendrils around like basically everything in culture. And it has to some extent, right?
There's elements of that. It's not in the way to say that doesn't make a lot of sense
In
for
that
me,
context, right?
because, like, say if the idea that paganism has kind of wrapped its tendrils around everything, I'm like, dude, being pagan should be really easy then,
Mm-hmm.
but it's definitely not. And because it's not acceptable to be like, hey, I'm pagan. Like, you do that, it's people don't shrug that off like they do with, hey, I'm a Christian.
Right.
uh they might have some prepackaged opinion about it or whatever, or even hey, I'm an atheist. That used to get a similar reaction to us. I don't think it does anymore. Even hey, I'm a pagan, some areas that's totally fine, but most places it's just not. um Cultural influence, sure. There's a lot of things that have influenced our culture that go all the way back to Rome, or go back to the Anglo-Saxon beliefs and cultural structures. But is that paganism wrapping its hands around it? Like, if you reject everything that's pagan, do you just not go to court,
Mm.
for example? Because that goes back to Roman and Anglo-Saxon. Like, our system of law and our system of adjudicating law arguably is from a pagan culture.
All right, and that
So it's
raises the
not Christian.
question:
So
what
yeah.
what is paganism exactly? Because I've heard that it's a belief in certain types of gods. I've heard that it's a belief, or I've heard that it was what farmers were, for example, or peasants that weren't Christian. Like, what is it? What constitutes a pagan practice or ritual or belief?
So it comes from the Latin word paganos,
Mm.
which essentially is the Latin. It was the Latin word for redneck. Essentially, it was like your farmer who works to the ground. Heathen is very similar. It comes from, like, just country dweller. Uh, and Christians would refer to pagans as heathens or anything like that. But as far as, like, building a definition for it, it's really hard to do. It's an umbrella term for a number of different things. As far as pagans itself identify, it's an umbrella term for any polytheist faith.
Mm.
But it's not always an umbrella term for any polytheist faith. Some pagans are kind of monotheistic. Some of them are pantheistic. Some of them are panentheistic.
Right.
Some of them are another variety of that.
It's just very
Um,
diverse.
right.
Yeah.
So, trying to say what some pagans are atheists.
Mm.
You have a whole movement of atheo pagans,
Mm.
that people that don't believe the gods exist, but they feel that the engagement with the archetypes of deity is spiritually valuable to them in one way or another. And that's something that I've given a lot of criticism about. Some of it's kind of silly, but I don't get atheopagans. I'm happy to help them because a lot of times, like, I've had a few atheopagans. They'll come to me for like, hey, I'm looking for historical sources on this kind of thing, and I'm happy to point into it and send them to it. But I have said several times that I don't necessarily understand atheopaganism. There's better defenders of it than me because I'm somebody who doesn't. I'm not into it, but there are some people that are very good at kind of explaining what they're doing. There's a book called Godless Paganism that it's full of memoirs of people that are atheopagans, kind of explaining what they do. It's a good read and it gives you like perspective, but it doesn't. I'm still not making the connection there. But anywho, as far as what is pagan, it's a family of beliefs and minority religions.
Pretty diverse, right? So
extremely diverse. There's no one thing that you can say about any group of pagans, really. It's hard to do.
Right. Well, Jehovah's Witnesses have done it, FYI. So let me.
Okay. What's their definition? I'm interested in hearing.
Well, the thing
have one,
is,
or do they just use it as a?
They just use it as a blanket derogatory term, pretty much. So let me switch to the.
It means what you hear, I guess. I don't know. Like there's a number of things like that when you get into those kind of groups.
And they're really picky and choosy about it. So I actually pulled up this list of things that Jehovah's Witnesses kind of condemn as being quote unquote pagan.
Pagan practices.
Yeah. Like there are a bunch of different things in here that are really, really shaky. Like, for example, they don't celebrate Christmas because of its pagan roots. The Christmas tree is a pagan symbol. It came from paganism, quote unquote.
Thing is, of the things that are celebrated in Christmas, the Christmas tree is the thing that probably isn't pagan.
Right.
It's really, really weird that that's what they're. I mean, I get it. Like, I thought it was pagan for the longest time. The idea of bringing a tree into your house, decorating it, and then putting gifts under it. Like, that's super fucking pagan, right? But can I cuss on here?
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. But it sounds like it's super pagan. But the origination of it is probably in German Christianity. Maybe it's influenced a little bit, but because wreaths are probably pagan. Wreaths are definitely pagan. But the Christmas tree itself, we don't have any. There's no evidence, which it would be hard to find evidence for something like that archaeologically. Right. But the practice seems to originate somewhere in Germany, where it's like maybe it's pagan. You could argue that it's possible, but there's nothing rock solid about the idea of the Christmas tree. Right.
Well, that's one of their big things is Christmas trees. They also they don't celebrate birthdays. For a number of reasons, but some of which is for pagan reasons.
I looked that up, birthdays.
Oh, yeah?
I found its origination is in German tradition, and it's probably pre-Christian. It's maybe pagan.
Pre-Christian.
Like, it's hard to, yeah.
According to Jehovah's Witnesses, pre-Christian means pagan, basically.
So all those Jewish traditions...
That's a fair point. Okay, aside from the Jewish traditions, they can trace Jewish back, but if it's non-Jewish, non-Christian, then it's evil.
The interesting thing about we're going down a windy path here, but we're like, as far as pre-Christian Judaism, it depends on how far back you go with pre-Christian Judaism, because archaeological evidence seems to suggest that the temple became monotheist around 500 BC or so. Like, there's a point where it was like, okay, yeah, the temple itself became monotheist somewhere in this point, like around the time of Solomon. But even the Bible talks about how there was other worship of other deities that came into the temple or that were set up around the city and that kind of thing. And there's reason for those stories, because a lot of the people, like your typical Semitic folk in that area, were polytheists.
So the Jewish people in that area were polytheists at that time, right?
Right. So there's Semitic. When people talk about Semitic polytheism, they're usually talking about Canaanite polytheism. But when looking back at, like, even in the area like Jerusalem, areas that were under biblical rule, there's evidence of polytheism there. There's an article I shared a while back that reference to idols of Egyptian deities in households found during Israel's existence. At a point where it was like, well, we thought they were monotheist at this point, but now we know that they're like, this shows that there were polytheist practices in the
There's
area
like
at the time.
there's like a timeline where you can see it turning from polytheist to monotheist. Then I guess basically,
Right, but it keeps getting later.
right,
It seems like, and to the point where the thing that you can justify as being monotheist is the temple itself. The people generally seem to have polytheist leanings. You know, there might have been, I'm sure that there was a monotheist population in Jerusalem, especially. But, you know, like history isn't so simple. You don't have like what would have actually existed would not have been everybody in this area is monotheist until you hit this border and then you go to Moab and suddenly they're pagans.
right.
It's
way
probably was a much
blended.
more gradient line there.
That's honestly why I find it almost comical that Jehovah's Witnesses are so like stuck on this paganism thing. Like every single thing here is like forbidden. You know, piñatas are discouraged at the very least because of
Piñatas.
Yeah, yes.
Sorry.
It's absurd.
All the fun shit is pagan. All right, cool.
Exactly right. You must be living it up over there as a pagan.
Definitely. Let me tell you. I mean, you know, it is fun. I'll be honest with you. But,
right?
Toasting I found interesting. For Yule Festival, the pagan group that I'm a part of, we all celebrate together, and there's a lot of alcohol as
What's Yule Festival
you
again?
want to do. It's a year is changing over kind of tradition. There's a couple of sources on what Yule actually is, and it's gets contradictory and complicated when you try and like get down to the bottom of like what it was actually being celebrated. There's ideas about Odin. There's ideas about like the empty part of the year between the winter solstice and the lunar calendar starting, and several ideas are discussed about like what exactly is going on there. But there's a lot of traditions that are celebrated around it, and modern heathens tend to see it as the year is ending. It's the darkest point of the year. Everybody get together, light a fire, have a great time. You know, there's definitely celebration to the gods in that, and as Odin as being like the center part of it. But as part of the celebration, with everybody getting together, there people make the toasts, boasts, and oaths to the following year, or to the year up to this point. A boast, they may talk about an achievement that they made for that year. A toast, they may thank somebody else for helping them through the year. Or an oath is a promise of what they're going to do for the next year that they make before the gods, and then they move forward.
What would that be? I guess the oath would be like New Year's resolution then, kind of.
Yeah, very similar. Yeah. So I mean, tell the Jehovah's Witnesses they can't do New Year's resolutions.
They
it's
don't.
pagan as fuck. But again, everything fun. But
yeah, exactly.
But I don't know. There's so much blending when you look at history going back into Judaic practices and the practices of the people around them. There's so much blur between what was practiced by one community and what was practiced by another, that their ability to source back what is inherently Christian and what isn't pagan influence into Jewish culture is an impossible feat.
Right.
Like, I don't know how they do that.
They try, but honestly, it is an absurd thing to try to do. And that's why you find things like them banning Easter, them banning Christmas and things like that, but they don't ban wedding rings. And in fact, I think they had a bit on here about wedding rings. It was, it says they admitted...
Go back to Egypt.
Do they? Are wedding rings a pagan thing, or quote unquote?
Wedding rings are Egyptian.
Okay. Well, they say...
That's the earliest, like they're like 5,000 years old or something like that. Like it's an incredibly old tradition.
It's old as
It's
fuck.
definitely pre-Christian pagan.
Right.
And it seems to originate with ancient Egypt and then spread from there. It just probably made it into Jewish culture. That's one of those things that pagans could have influenced Judaism, and then you have it show up in Judaism.
Right.
You know,
it's like they're really picky and choosy about what they are okay with. I mean, they admit that that wedding rings are pagan, but they have no issue with that. Excommunication
Really?
and yeah, 100% for real.
Is there verses about wedding rings in the Bible or something like that? Is that why they make it okay? I don't
They
even know.
say the
Cool,
wedding
cool.
ring at one time had religious significance, yet most people today do not know that, considering a wedding ring mere evidence that someone is married. That's their answer to it. Yes, it's pagan. Most people don't know that, so we don't care.
Most people don't know about Easter being pagan
Or
or what
Christmas.
elements of it there are. Like
Right.
celebrating the rising of Christ isn't necessary. It's Christian. I mean, unless you consider the archetype of the rising God to be pagan, at which point, Jehovah's Witnesses have a really big problem.
Yeah.
But if celebrating that isn't pagan, it was like early Christians were doing that. You could say that the festival got influenced later on with the whole like rabbit and egg thing. Um, but that's another one that's really kind of interesting about. We don't know exactly what the origin of the rabbit and egg thing is.
Is it
There's
from
some.
paganism or?
So the idea is that there's an English writer named Bede who writes, I believe, in the 800s about the belief in a goddess named Ostara, and that her practices that she's associated with fertility, and that is representation is through rabbits and eggs. But Bede is the only place where this is even mentioned at all. There's no other mention of it anywhere. And Bede was writing about was supposed to be a widely held Germanic deity. Now, pagans are split on this. Some people regard Ostara as a deity that's made up by Christians. Others are consider Ostara to be very important to the changing of seasons rituals around the equinox.
Yeah, it's not as cut and dry, basically.
Right. It isn't, and it could have been that Christians came up with the whole rabbit and egg thing. It's conceivably possible. It seems unlikely to me. I side with the idea that Ostara was practiced, because there's other parts of, like, there's some statues in France that seem to suggest that this was a thing. But again, it's not something that you can like go out and prove.
Right.
And you never will be. So you can either go with it or you just don't.
Right. Well,
And a lot of pagans choose to go with it. A lot of pagans choose to be like, well, the whole judgment. But the idea that like don't celebrate Easter at all, like I can see abandoning the Easter bunny, but not even doing the whole let's go to church and take communion and all that jazz.
recognize Jesus or whatever they do.
Right.
Yeah.
Like celebrate that fact that is the basis of salvation in the Christian faith. That seems reasonable.
Right.
Like, do they have like a
No.
special church day at all, or is it just like any other Sunday?
It is just like any other Sunday, but they do have the memorial of Jesus' death. So, where Jesus is sitting around with his people and they passed around the wine and the bread and everything before he died.
The Last Supper.
The Last Supper, pretty much, yeah. That they do that. It's basically communion. They pass that stuff around once a year, and it's around Easter time, but it doesn't represent the same thing exactly. And they go by like the lunar calendar to figure it out and everything. So it's never on the same.
Yeah, lunar
day as
calendar.
Easter.
That's not pagan at all.
Right? That's a very good point. Like, if you're gonna take toasting off the table and or piñatas, then you have to take literally everything off the table.
Yeah, like toasting is really, because that's not particularly. So I've had a few conversations about Christians and pagan practices and whether or not it is unchristian to do a pagan practice. And I don't think that Christians should have a problem with it theologically. So with pagans, like a lot of what we're interested in doing with respect to any ritual that we perform, there's intention and reciprocity with deity that is part of the engagement. And reciprocity with deity is essentially that you give a gift, sacrifice to a deity, and then establish a relationship with that deity so that gifts may come back. Or with the hope that gifts may come back. Christians, when they engage in practices that may be inspired by pagan practices from back in the day, aren't doing anything like that. They're not going in with the intention of engaging with deity. They aren't establishing any sort of reciprocity with a pagan god. They're just doing things. Like, they're just moving a tree into their house and making it a place to put gifts. There's no
intention
of
behind it.
Right. It's let's celebrate Christmas.
Right.
You know, if they do it with the intention of giving alms to Santa, they may be accidentally worshiping Odin, arguably. But it's hard to say you're accidentally giving ritual to a deity because intention is so important as far as like our understanding of ritual. So the Christian recoiling at things that they believe might be pagan is very interesting to me, because they're afraid of even touching that space of things that pagans do sometimes in relation to anything related to their culture. And while we can talk about how in a lot of these societies, religion and culture weren't necessarily separate. That's a Christian thing. Christians started separating religion from culture and then making it spread, and then using religion to influence culture. Whereas if you went back in time to 500 AD in Germany and started hanging out with the Suebo or some other tribe or whatever, they wouldn't see a difference necessarily between religion and cultural practices. All of it would be spiritual because all of it runs with that intention.
Right.
Christians are very separated about it. So what they're doing without any intention, it being accidentally pagan, doesn't make any sense from a pagan perspective. We're just like, how do you...
It does not square up.
So when it gets into
things
like toasting isn't even a religious act necessarily, unless you're, depending on how interacting you're getting with it. But it's not alms to a deity.
It's just something that the people did, I guess.
Right. It's more of like giving respect to your friend if you're toasting.
Right.
There's no God involved in that exchange.
It's pretty obvious that they're like overly obsessed with what's pagan and what isn't. And I actually talked about this thing that I call placing extreme importance on events or ideas, where it's like, this is honestly the perfect example. Like, is it really worth separating yourself from an entire like cultural event like Christmas just so that you don't risk like upsetting God by possibly taking part in some possibly fabricated ritual, like pagan ritual? It's honestly ridiculous.
It sounds like that they just kind of want to be spiritual hipsters.
Yeah.
That's kind of a weird way of saying it, where it's like, you know, all the cool kids, everybody else is doing Christmas, but you know, we are not doing that normie stuff.
Holy shit.
I've
never connected the dots. That's such a good way to say it. Well, listen, man, we've been on here for a while. I appreciate you coming on and talking to me. Why don't you tell people about your channel and where they can find you? You have a YouTube channel, right?
Yeah. YouTube channel is Ocean Keltoy, youtube.com/Ocean Keltoy. And you can also find me on Twitter. It's Ocean Keltoy, KELTOI. And you run a YouTube channel where I basically talk about like polytheist ideas and a little bit about history sometimes, and going into some philosophical arguments on stuff. And most recently I started engaging on, there's people bringing up paganism in politics. Somebody started trying to say that environmentalism is pagan, and I, dealt with that in a really snarky way, but it was fun.
I saw that. I'll put links in the description, FYI, so people can click on stuff. Just send me some links and I'll drop them in there. But again, appreciate you coming on and talking to me. It's been an awesome conversation, and I will talk to you next time, okay?
Absolutely, man.
If you like what I do and you want to make sure I can continue to do it, you can support me in a few ways. First, you can support me on Patreon. That's probably the best way. But if you want to get something back for your support, you can check out my Teespring. I'm trying to make a shirt design for every cult I've covered. I haven't gotten every one, but I'm working on it. So check it out and see if your cult is up there. Second, you can support me by checking out my game shop. I sell controller, cartridge, and game box stands for every system from the original Nintendo and Sega Game Gear to the Xbox One and Nintendo Switch. So give that a look too. And finally, if you want to support me in some way other than monetarily, you can check out my other YouTube channels. I have a retro game channel where I answer questions like, why does Shy Guy have a mask? And why are CRT TVs the best way to play retro games? I also have the podcast where I talk about stuff I don't feel I can say on a monetized channel. And finally, I have my main channel where I talk about cults. I wish I didn't have to worry about dancing around subjects carefully in the first place, but I chose to do this as a full-time job, so unfortunately I rely on YouTube's AdSense and on the support of patrons to continue doing the work I do. Anyways, check me out in all those places if you haven't already. Thanks for listening, guys.